vamos começar então, antes que a sala fique um pouco mais fácil. Antes de mais, queria agradecer o convite. Muito obrigado pelo convite. Foi com muito gosto aqui. Infelizmente, só pude vir a parte da tarde. Achei muito interessante, muito estimulante. Bom, a sessão vai ser em inglês, portanto, vamos começar a falar em inglês. E vamos acabar a noite, desculpem, a tarde, a falar de desigualdades. Portanto, o tema mais bonito, talvez. I want to thank you, Professor Dominique Joye. Professor Dominique Joye is professor at the University of Lausanne, researcher at the Lifecourse and Social Inequality Research Center. He has been working on several international projects related with educational inequality, family and life course, social mobility, and so on. He has published several articles in international journals like Survey Research Methods, Comparative Population Studies, European Sociological Review, European Journal of Population, and so on. And he is also collaborating with ICS in the project related with Lifecourse and social networks. So he's going to present his talk about social inequalities and in the context of Lifecourse. We have 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. And please apologize not to be able to speak Portuguese. I would like to do it, but I am unable, unfortunately, of. And the idea of this talk is that's the end of a long day. And so the idea is just to discuss some points, to present some points, and to have also a little bit of discussion. You will see that there will be two main points. The first point is the question of the measure, because I think the question of measure is very important, and very often we use just some measure without knowing or without thinking about to everything which is behind. Try to show you that it's interesting to try to look inside. And the second point is the context of Lifecourse, because I think the context of Lifecourse is one interesting point in this sense. So, yes. So, in this title, you have the idea to measure social inequalities. And what is measuring social inequalities in this case? I will insist on resources, the differences in resources. And in this case, I will insist also, because we have spoken a lot about networks and so on resources that we can have in the networks and what we can do with these resources. That's the first one. Second point that I will discuss a little bit more is the measure of social position. You know, of course, that social position is very often measured by class, belonging to class position, and sometimes by some summary of indexes and so on. And there is important difference between both approaches. Even both could be useful and interesting to discuss in such a context too. And of course, to speak a little bit about Lifecourse. To speak for Lifecourse, just to begin with this aspect, this morning, Jacques-Antoine has recalled to you the 5 cardinal principles, the 5 laws of Lifecourse, if you want. In the case, I will insist on 3, not 5, but 3. The first one in the principle of linked lives. Okay, we have spoken about the networks, people are living in relation, and we will see also that could be used as a measure of social position. So the composition of the network is also somewhere related to the position of the people in the society. And this is clearly a fact that we have to take into account if we want to take into account this idea of Lifecourse into the measure. This is, of course, a characteristic to take. Second one is the idea of places. People are living in some geographic areas. And each of these areas offers some particular opportunity structures. Very often it's considered, there is a little bit the same discussion as Eric has presented this morning. So very often the geographical scale is presented as a scale going from the most local to the most global one, just with concentric circle like this. And I think it's not the most interesting way to conceptualize this. And we have really to speak about different contexts which have different scales. And the scales of the pertinent context in some cases could be different than the one of the other pertinent cases. So that's the first point. The second point is, if we speak about places, also places into the society, we have to speak about distances. And if we speak about distances, we could think also to mobility, because we can go from one place to the other. So that means that if we want to have a complete program on this kind of thing, we have to take into account the mobility done either in the social space, either in the geographical space. This is the first one. And there is some of our colleagues that insist that mobility is not the only point, but we can also consider motility, which is, if you want, the capital, the resources that you have, the ability that you have to move in this space. So very often, which is important is not to be really able to it's to be able to move, not really to do the move. And so the concept of the resources that you can have, which is the ability to move in this social and geographical space. And of course, we have spoken about time, as well the time as the period, as well as the time as the place in the life course and so on. The beautiful Lexis diagram that Jacques-Antoine has presented this morning is, of course, important in this sense. Just to go quickly, if we think about social resources, we know all that normally the classes are defined by access to some resources. Mostly is some resources linked to work. And after that, there is different weight given to different resources. If you think, for example, to the work of right, that clearly discuss the access to resources, either organizational assets or educational and informational asset as one more dimension. Okay, we have different kind of resources that we can consider. The one that we want to consider too in this research is the networks. In itself, the composition of the networks is also part of the research. And there is an important theoretical discussion that we can try to have. I will not have the time to do that, but Eric has mentioned it this morning. It's a discussion about social capital, which is often described by civic participation in an association or this kind of institution. But for me, it's also even more important in the resources that you can have in the networks. And this have also some impact of the measure of the network that you use, of course, and the way that you consider it in the network. Try to come back, but I think it's a point that could be interested to discuss. Okay. So we have already mentioned that we must take into account geographic mobility, social mobility, and social distances inside the network. In this presentation, after that, I will more insist on the social distances inside the network, which is enough to discuss in the 10 minutes that I have still. But nevertheless, I think it's important to take into account also the other dimension in a complete panorama of what we want to try to do. Okay. Very quickly, if I can. I have just mentioned that we can speak about class and we can speak about socioeconomic indexes in order to measure the position into the society of the people. Normally, you have broad choices of different classes. More or less every author has his own classification and say, okay, that's the best or that's the most interesting for this reason or this reason. In fact, in the international market of the classification, if I can say like this, there are two dominant ones. Well, there was two dominant ones. One was one of Eric Colin Wright, which was Marxist by origin, very interesting, but also a little bit complicated to measure. So there was not so many success because many researchers think that it was too difficult to use Wright measure because it needs too much question and indicators to use it. The second one was, of course, the EGP, so the Erickson-Goltor-Portocarrero classification, which is just more or less the same in the ESEC, which was proposed for the European, which is really interesting by the success. It was the one used for mostly all the social mobility studies. But we can discuss also that it was a little bit of British industrial idea behind this story. And the idea of the service relation that define the position is something which is clearly adapted in the Great Britain of the 80s or the 70s. But perhaps it's not the most interesting to use if we think to the transformation that the whole society has known. So I would propose to use the one of Daniel Husch, which is a Swiss researcher, because he not only used, and I will speak a little more detail later, not only use a vertical dimension, as of course as all of this classification, but also try to discuss an horizontal one, which is also linked to first the growth of the education and the years of education that we have in every country. So we must take into account this change in the educational system and the weight of the education as a social resources, which is important too. And at least in the case of Switzerland, but I think it's also the case in most countries, the growing importance of the female the women in the labor force. So this feminization of the labor force changed a little bit also the value, by quote, of some position. And so he proposed to distinguish three work logic: the technical, which is the classical production side, the organizational or management side, or the interpersonal, where the relation between the people is the most determining one. I think I will first present this one to you and go back to the ISEI after that. So the idea of the Husch classification is to have this both classification. One, you have the independent entrepreneurial peoples on the left, which is the classical resource, and after that you have the three work logic: technical, the technical work logic, the management work logic, and the interpersonal work logic, if you want. And you have different vertical position in this. So, of course, it's a little bit difficult to use in the survey. So there is a simpler version in 8 categories. First, with the people which are independent or employers, and after that, just 2 positions in these 3 work logics. And I will try to show you that it's important to consider not only the vertical dimension, but also this horizontal one in further analysis. I have to rush a little bit. So, just to go back there, you know, everyone, you know that there is this kind of socioeconomic index and all index of prestige or vertical dimension of the position that just rank all the people on one dimension. Normally people use the ISEI, which was proposed by Treiman and Gansebaum in 92, with the idea that it's valid for every country, every context, and every situation, which of course is a little bit questionable proposition, but nevertheless. But there is an alternative which is more interesting in the logic that we have. It's the CAMSIS measure. The idea is to say, okay, we know that the probability to meet inside the society is depending on the social position. So we can use the probability to meet as a measure of social distance. And if we use this measure of social distance, okay, in this case we have a measure that is produced by the social reality and the social examples. At the beginning, CAMSIS was, which is the Cambridge scales, was used by the networks, the position of the people of France inside the networks. After that, it was built by the position of the couples, but it's the same idea. It's the position of the people inside the society defines some social distances. In the last part of this paper, we mostly use the ISEI, but of course it would be better to use CAMSIS, but just for the reason of time that I've done most graphs with the ISEI. It doesn't change so much, but just to show that it's interesting to have a complete classification. So there you have the Husch classification on the left with the independent, technical, managers, interpersonal, and in both cases the upper and the lower one. And there it's the ISEI, so it's this socioeconomic score, and you see clearly that you have some differences in the vertical side, of course, but according to the different work logic, the difference is not the same, so you have to take both dimensions at the same time. Okay, so we have the tools there, and we have a measure of social position that takes into account the work logics and not only the vertical dimension, and we have some measure of prestige or something like that, of social position on this vertical dimension. Why we use both? It's also, okay, I can do that there. It's a characteristic of the Swiss survey. So very quickly, in Switzerland we have more or less the same survey as we have spoken about, with one or two differences. One difference is that we have only 2 cohorts and not 3, so we don't have the oldest one. And another characteristic of the Swiss survey, we have the indication of the occupation inside the network. So for every person to the network, but not the indication if the people were independent or not independent. That means that for ego, we can use a real class position because we have all this information. But for all the people into the network, we have just to use the ISCO coding without indication of independent or not. That means that we have to go back to these kind of indexes where we can build them without the information about the status at the work. Okay. It was too complicated to have the information, needing too many time. The people doesn't know always if the people in the network are independent and so on. So that's why we decided that. So I go very quickly. Okay. So in the last 5 minutes that I have, I will try to show you 1 or 2 results in this sense. The first one, and the question that we have, is do different social positions correspond to different type of networks? Do social position correspond to different social composition of the networks? And to continue the discussion that we have had this afternoon, offer the support given or received differ according to social position. So the idea is not only to consider the family characteristics of the network, but to have the idea that the kind of support that you can give or receive is also depending on your position and not only on the composition of the network and family or not family and so on. So the first graph there, you have once again the 8 Hush classes, and you have the size of the network, and you see that mostly it's not so different. So you don't have a clear differences in size. You have a little bigger networks in the case of independent petit bourgeoisie. You have a little bit smaller networks in some of the category in the technical world, but it's not really a big differences. So at least in our data, we don't have real differences between classes according to the size of the network. That's not astonishing at all, but just good to have in mind. There is no reason that the size in itself of the network is different, but still worth the control. If you look to the social position of the network, you have a small technical problem because you have normally many persons into the network. And so, which is the good measure when you have many persons? So the first idea is just to take the mean. And if you take the mean, okay, everything is fine. You have these vertical differences as you expect. And you have also a little bit of differences. For example, in the interpersonal logic, so the professional, sociocultural professional, have a little bit higher networks than the other one. And okay, so you have this kind of difference, that's fine. But if you think in terms of support, for example, and if you expect that it is important to have at least one person into the network that can give you some help in some cases, and that the people in an upper position will have more opportunity to give help. So the good measure in such a case is not the mean position, but is the maximum position that you have into the network. So, oops. Okay, I go like this. I think it's this one. And you see that there is a little bit more differences in this case. So probably in terms of social resources, which is important is to consider if you have some people in an upper position that can give you help at some condition. once again, there the easy measure is not the better one, but you have clearly a little bit more differentiation that you have in the mean structure, which is correct according to what we can expect of this kind of thing. Okay, I will skip this one. Because you can also have some reasoning about the minimal position that you have into the networks, and in there you will expect normally more homogeneity, except in some particular social position that is the case. And clearly the bourgeoisie and the large employer are the one which, of course, is at least a smaller probability to have people from low position in the network. Okay. And, okay, the last graph. Yes, I am Swiss, it's okay. The last graph that I have to show to you is linked to the discussion of this afternoon. So, you remember that we have some question about giving financial support, material support, or care. And there was a distinction between giving or receiving. In the case, if I consider the position of ego, of course, I will have more differences in giving than receiving, because you expect that the direction is depending about the position of the one which is at the beginning of the story, and so you will have more differences for giving material support than for receiving financial support between social classes, which is in fact empirically true. The other point is to which will be the categories which has the higher probability to give support. In this case, the graph is the reverse. So the upper category, the darkest one, is the 0. So it's not to give support. And this is to give to 1%, 2%, 3%, and so on. So if in this category, which is the highest one, if you want, the difference between the 0 and the 1, that's the case where you give most material support. And you see, it's interesting that this category is the petit bourgeoisie. So it's the case of the small independents and so on, probably which have enterprises which are also more familiar in this direction and so on, are the people which give most of material support. And the other category where the support is high is the category which are based on interpersonal work logic. And you can effectively expect that independently of the vertical dimension, that's in the category where the interpersonal dimension is the most prominent, if you want, that in the case you will have the most important support to be given to the family. You can go further in this kind of analysis and distinguish between support given to family members or to friends, and in fact the structure is not so much different if you do this kind of differences. I do not want to present them, but the structure doesn't change so much. And if you look to financial support or care or so on, the structure is not so much different neither, and it's more or less the same kind of figure that you can have. I don't want to go into all the detail, but I just wanted to show you that you have some differences in the type of support which is given, and of course it's not the lowest category that gives most support to the other. The reverse, the bourgeoisie and this kind of profession which are involved in interpersonal work logic are the ones that give more support in a more general. So it's really sketchy, it's just first result, but just to show you that my expectation that the resources that you can have in the networks and the social position have some very important links that could be mobilized in the term of social support in general. So, that's more or less the conclusion. We have to think about the contextualization of the social position according to the network. We have seen the importance of the networks in terms of resources, which is clearly important. We have seen the relation between social position and network characteristics, and we have still to introduce the impact of social and geographic mobility into this system, because it's very important for the creation of the networks and their functioning field. And the last point, I think that I have convinced you, but I was sure that you were already convinced, that the measure is important, and it's important to try to find even for social position and the background variables and so on, the measure which is really linked to the theory or the theoretical perspective that you want to use. Okay, so that's it. Obrigado.
Thank you. I forgot to present Pierre Alain Roche. He's a PhD student at the University of Lausanne, and I think he's working on inequality and mainly precarious work. Thank you for the presentation and at time. So, questions, comments?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I have a couple of questions, but maybe I just ask. First, are the results controlled for other variables? Like, for instance, the very interesting effect of service work.
Yeah.
You can maybe say that women are more inclined in service work, so is it not an effect of sex differences? And a second very technical question, did you get rid of the partners, or are they included in your measurements? Because obviously there is a lot of homogamy there. So.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah. Okay. So the second question before, because that's the easiest one. No, I do not get off of the partner, just because I was for this presentation a little bit structuralist, if you want, to say it's a network like it is, and if the partner is mentioned, so it is important, and if there is no partner, okay, that's the same. The networks, we look to the resource of the network as it is defined by the question of the important person. Doesn't matter which other the person. So it's a little bit brutal, but I think it's coherent with the idea of the social resources that you can find in the network.
And you could also, following this logic, you explain why you included parents, because parents are also in the networks.
Yeah, could be. No, doesn't matter. But the point is, at least some years ago, but I think it's still the case, you have more or less the same social distances, to say the thing like that, as ego to the parents, ego to the partner, or ego to the friends in the networks. So, more or less, you are in the same range of homogamy, homophilia, and so on, and probably it doesn't disturb so much the result. Still to be controlled, but so far, all the studies that I've done in Switzerland show that it's more or less the same type of structure. So I don't think it's a problem to address, I agree with you, but even if we do not follow my argument to say the network is a network, probably doesn't change so much what we have. It's the first one. The second point here about women, you're perfectly right. But I had taken the argument of Daniel saying we need to have a classification of the social position which take into account also the specificity of the position of the woman inside the society. So we know that this category, especially this one, is the most feminine one. Okay. But it's not a random fact that is also the most feminine one. So in this sense, we have already a control of the gender effect just by using a typology we take into account the gender structure into the occupation. So once again, I agree with you that the normal logic of decomposition of the factors, so when you play like a small chemist adding a little bit of this one and so on, you have to control by. In fact, the structure itself has has something gendered and add to have something gendered through the definition. So it's why it's, at least in the first draft, it's correct to do the thing like that. Well, by code. But of course, subject to discussion.
My question is a technical question related with the question that Eric posed. You have these 8 positions, but how does Roche's scheme resolves the position of husband and wife, which it's the main income earner position, it's a combination of both.
The urge schema by itself has the discussion in the book, but it's not linked to the classification itself. Well, what I have taken as a position here is to take the individual position. So the idea in the case is to say for these things, it's not a household position which is important, but that's an individual position, because also the networks is built around the individual. We are not in the logic of Goldthorpe where the household is an economic unit, if you want, but we have into the resources that one individual can mobilize. So it's really individual in this sense. The only point where you can have two options, in this case I have done the conservative one, but you can have a least conservative one that in the case doesn't change the result but change in a lot in other cases, is to limit to the people which have at the time an occupation, or to try to infer the occupation from the last one that they have had. And of course, it's not too much a problem for the men of the oldest generation, because if they are into retirement, it's perhaps 1 or 2 years. But it's clearly a problem for the women which have not more work from 20 years or something like that. So in the case I was conservative, just taking the people with the actual, which have actually an occupation. So that means I have lost more or less 1/3 of the sample.
It's the same question, but have you used income, Kenthouse, for instance, as a control variable?
Yes and no. The point is, you can use income if you want, even if I think you have the measure only for ego and not for the people in the networks, of course. And very often the measure of the network is not so good because you have a lot of approximation and so on. In the case, I do not think, we can have this kind of discussion, but I do not think that you will have more or less, you will have, if you cross H classes with income, you will have something like that. It's more or less the same, that the relation that you have with is a, just to say like this. So you have in two cases an upper and lower case in each category, which is the vertical dimension. And after that, you will have a little bit lower income in the production side rather than in the management or the social interpersonal side, which is a little bit more complicated. But so probably you will have something like that. And I don't think it adds too much of an information, because we are more speaking about position in the social structure and the link to the resources, which is than individual resources like income, for example. The same, I have used a simplified version of Ush that doesn't take Ush at the end to do a little bit of correction for education. And there was a heavy discussion with Erickson saying that's not a good idea to mix social position measure and education, because education is an individual resources which is independent of the place that the people have. So if you are really in this line, you have to look at the position defined by the occupation and perhaps control after by some individual parameters like income or education, which is interesting in the logic of the decomposition and analysis.
Okay. Just acabamos. Thank you once again.
And a question to Dominique. Out of curiosity and many years. You have the possibility in the course of your work, not particularly only in this time, but to compare how different approaches work. I mean, whether they are compatible or tend to explode. Because in Portugal we have people working with different and even self-made. Myself, I have used a simplified version of Goldthorpe and controlling by education and income in order to correct some too much disparities. And then you can compare, for instance, with the work with our colleagues from Coimbra, using Holland Right.
Yeah.
But also people using things more like just next door. And to see how they they account for, because what tends to happen is that some are better at accounting for some areas and others are better for other.
Yeah. For example, we have presented the paper 2 years ago in a manifestation for the 40 years of the distinction of Bourdieu, precisely comparing on Bourdieu's space different socio-professional classification. And in this case, of course, Goldthorpe and Essex was very bad, because there you have a lot of variability to explain in the upper classes. And the idea of the two upper side professionals are just mixing up all these upper classes professionals. So that means that you have no variation explained in such a case by this kind of classification. So you have a lot of these things. The problem, which is in fact interesting, that's the explanatory power of the classification depends on the mechanism that you want to explain. That means also that you can begin to think about which are the characteristics of the classification which are linked to the mechanism that you want to explain, and to use, in fact, the explanatory power as an explanation of what is really going on in the process that you want to use. So in this sense, I don't think that there is a better one. But it's important to incorporate the logic of the classification inside the process that you are considering, and you can even test the adequacy of the theoretical model just by looking at the explanation that you have at the end.
Okay. Agora que mesmo. Não sei se
Thank you very much.